The great teacher of mythology, Joseph Campbell, once defined the heroic journey this way. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. There is no greater heroic journey than the one taken by Odysseus in Homer's The Odyssey. The Odyssey is Homer's unofficial sequel to the Iliad, but the Iliad psychologically is a story that deals with the journey we must all take during the first half of life. The focus there is on building the ego so it can withstand its eventual dismantling when we hit the second half of life. We build a career, a reputation, a family. The Odyssey deals with the descent that comes upon us at midlife. One of the most often quoted lines that addresses this very point belongs to the Italian poet Dante, and it comes from his Commedia. Midway through life's journey, I wandered into dark wood. What is this dark wood? The journey Odysseus takes tells you what this dark wood looks like. The story reads like a fairy tale, but if you know how to work with the symbolism, you begin to understand what it is pointing to. So this is a story about where we find ourselves in our lives at the halfway point. If we're lucky, we may have not offended the gods, but most likely we have, because the gods are internal energies, and many of us have transgressed against ourselves by following the wrong path, the one set out by our parents or society. We arrive at midlife a shell of ourselves and are confronted with the fact that death is closer than ever and that we may have not yet really fully lived. Now, many of us will just project our unlived lives onto our children, and thus the cycle continues. But for those brave enough to take on the midlife journey, the Odyssey provides a sort of roadmap. What makes the story so compelling is the character of Odysseus. He is wise in a way that none of the characters in the Iliad show themselves to be. He is a great representation in the leap of consciousness that has taken place between the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Odyssey asks the big human questions about who you are and what you have come to this life to explore and develop. Now, at midlife, those parts of you that no longer serve your growth must die, as all of Odysseus' men die during his long journey home. Those men are representative of parts of Odysseus himself, of his own psyche. And reading the story psychologically, you could argue he is shedding those parts of himself he no longer needs in order to become whole. The Odyssey is also significant because it represents a world that has evolved notably from the Iliad. The gods have mostly disappeared here, except for Pallas Athena, who shows up as a guide and mentor to Odysseus' son, Telemachus, and who aids Odysseus himself when it is required. Now, Athena is the goddess who emerged fully armed from Zeus's head, so she's a feminine presence who has some strong masculine properties as well. The feminine in its entirety is a strong presence in this story, and that is because one of the major tasks at midlife is to integrate the feminine or the masculine in yourself by removing the projections you have had on the real flesh and blood masculine and feminine presences in your life. Throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus encounters the various anima figures that represent his feminine side, the side that connects him to others and to life itself. As he integrates these energies, by not succumbing to them, he stays, for example, with the goddess Calypso for 8 years, but eventually forsakes the pleasures of her company and even the promise of immortality by leaving. It should be noted that he also escapes her fierce embrace, which allows for no growth and no forward movement. His aim is his reconnection to his anima in its purest form, his wife Penelope. Archetypally, what is meant here is that the unconscious and the conscious mind must unite. On his long journey towards home, Odysseus encounters many obstacles, many enemies. The most notable is the sea god Poseidon. Now, Poseidon is representative of the unconscious and all the unknown interior territory we have not yet mapped. The way home, the way back to oneself is not easy. It means being torn between the opposites of resisting regressive temptations that dope you up but do not feed or satiate your soul hunger. It means coming to terms with the limits of your own ego. Now finally he makes the underworld descent, the night journey on the ocean, and meets the hero of the Iliad, Achilles, who is not at all heroic in the underworld, and who reminds Odysseus that it is better to be alive as a peasant in the world above than in the underworld as he is, a hero. What is in the above world and the world of consciousness rejuvenates and revives. Now in the underworld, Odysseus consults with the most evolved seer of the time, the blind Tiresias. Carl Jung spoke of this meeting as expressing the psychological mechanism of the introversion of the conscious mind into the deepest layers of the unconscious. There are monsters to be found there, to be sure, but that is also where the greatest treasure can be found. Odysseus' eventual homecoming and reunion with his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus happens after he has integrated those parts of himself that will allow for deeper connection to others and, of course, to himself. We have traveled now from the heroic in the guise of the warrior Achilles to the more mature representation of that ideal, Odysseus, who is a master storyteller and who regenerates the society through the recounting, the retelling of his tales. We have moved from the world of action to the world of contemplation and have united them both. The Jungian writer Edward Edinger puts it this way: as the second half of life proceeds, the ego must accept its own diminishment and its relative unimportance in relation to the self. We must not succumb to the fierce regressive embrace of what our culture wants for us, or disappear into our additions or the ego dictates of the first half of life. We must not rework our lives according to the same pattern that we have set out. It's worth reading what Carl Jung himself had to say about this midlife journey in his essay, The Stages of Life. He says, in order to characterize this change within the psyche, I must take for comparison the daily course of the sun. In the morning, it rises from the nocturnal sea of unconsciousness and looks upon the wide, bright world which lies before it in an expanse that steadily widens the higher it climbs in the firmament. At the stroke of noon, the descent begins, and the descent means the reversal of all the ideals and values that we cherished in the morning. The sun falls into contradiction with itself. It is as though it should draw in its rays instead of emitting them. So the question we must all ask ourselves at the midpoint in our lives is, are we ready to make the descent, or are we stuck trying to hold on madly to the stroke of noon? It takes real courage to let go, to discard the bits of ourselves that no longer serve us, to integrate those energies that we have projected into the wider world. But the journey is necessary. We are to become who we are meant to be. Many have succumbed as they made their way through, but those who fail to make the journey may die, never having fully lived.